So we know that directors or assistant directors or whoever's in charge of a shoot, when the scene is done, yell and cut, right? So many of the stories we know, both fictional and non-fictional, are framed, they're told, in such a way as to walk away from the climax without spending any real time or any real audience or reader energy on contemplating what happens next. The heroes have won, the villain is defeated, let's celebrate with some dancing Ewoks, or ride off into the sunset with a rousing John Williams score, right? As my daughter's favorite stories all end, and they lived happily ever after. No need to worry about the details. Famously, Peter Jackson's film version of The Return of the King was criticized by some, and my unbiased opinion, unbiased in any way, is that this criticism is foolish, but, you know, hey, because it had multiple endings. And it's about 30 minutes of runtime in the movie. In reality, J.R.R. Tolkien, the author, as a World War I veteran, who lost almost every classmate and friend to the war, but one or two, knew the story does not end when the war does. His story needed to dwell on what happens next to our beloved fellowship, because he knew that what happens next is important. You can't tell the story without it. That makes his novel all the more powerful, and the movie as well. Let's take a look at what happens next. The climax, of course, is the flood, and the waters rise, and the ark is on the waves. But what happens next? Before we look at the actual text, this is something I don't normally do, but I wanted to point out to you the literary symmetry that is in the narrative of Noah. You see the numbers. It begins with 7 days of waiting for the flood, and then that is repeated. We talked about the repetition. There's more of it in our text this morning. 7 days of waiting for the flood, and then 40 days of flood, and then 150 days while the waters are rising and covering everything. And then the heart of the message, which we're going to dwell on a good amount this morning, but God remembered Noah, here at 8:1, and then after that, 150 days of the waters waning, 40 days of Noah waiting, 7 days of waiting, and then 7 more days of waiting. This is something that ancient literary texts do on purpose, to highlight something. What do they want to highlight? What do they want to draw our attention to? The very heart of this story, literally, from the way it's structured, is this verse. But God remembered Noah and all the wild animals and the livestock that were with him in the ark. As we saw with that previous slide's structural analysis, but God remembered Noah is the heart of the story. The place our attention is supposed to be drawn to. And what is that place? The faithfulness of God. God, of course, can't forget like we do. We forget things all the time, and that leads to all sorts of trouble in our marriage, at our job, all that kind of thing. But when God is said to remember in Scripture, it's not the opposite of forgetting. It's not remembering and forgetting. It's the opposite of inaction. When God remembers, it's often his promises, his covenants, his people. That's what he remembers. And then God takes action to rectify their situation. When the text says God remembers, he's about to do something. When last we saw Noah and his family and the animals, they were sealed inside the ark with the flood waters raging outside. Chapter 7:24, which we just ended last week's message with, ended the account of the flood waters rising by telling us that this situation is going to last 150 days. Now that God has remembered them, what will he do? He sent a wind over the earth, and the waters receded. There are parallels, both in structure and imagery, scattered throughout Genesis. Things referring to other parts of Genesis. It's all over the place, almost too many of them to mention sometimes. We've already seen how the flood account is a parallel of the creation story. That's hearkening back to the creation story and reminding us that this is recreation. But here the image of God providing the way forward with a divinely mandated wind would certainly have evoked in the Israelites who are receiving this revelation at Sinai their own recent journey through the Red Sea on dry land after God had sent a wind the night before. In both cases, God chooses to act on behalf of his chosen people. God demonstrates that he's not only their God, but their mighty deliverer as well. And so we have a parallel to the Exodus here. Now the springs of the deep and the floodgates of the heavens had been closed, and the rain had stopped falling from the sky. As it continues to do, the narrative is utilizing the ancient world's cosmology by speaking of the springs of the deep and the floodgates of the heavens. I suppose the wind wouldn't do much good if the rain was still falling, so it's good that the rain stopped. Such cross purposes were possible when people believed in a pantheon of gods who were often at odds with each other, sometimes at war with each other. But Noah, and of course later Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Moses, and the Israelites, they worship the one true living God, who was not only the sole maker of heaven and earth, but also its sustainer. So when it is in God's will that the rains stop and the waters begin to recede, that's what happens. The water receded steadily from the earth. At the end of the 150 days, the water had gone down, and on the 17th day of the 7th month, the ark came to rest on the mountains of Ararat. The waters continued to recede until the 10th month, and on the first day of the 10th month, the tops of the mountains became visible. We have in this section two more exact dates, keeping with what we saw last week, when the ark came to rest and when the mountains were visible. The location of the mountains of Ararat have inspired adventurers for centuries who thought they could, for some reason, find the remains of a wooden boat somehow that's at least 6,000 or more years old. Why they thought it would still be sitting there, I have no idea, but people continue to look. Interestingly, the location isn't in Mesopotamia, where the rivers described in the Eden narrative are located, but somewhere far to the north. We actually don't know where Noah lived before the flood. So we have no way of knowing if this mountain is anywhere near where they started from or not. This is where they're going to start over from, but we don't know, are they far from home? Are they near home? Do they recognize this place? We don't know any of that because we don't know where they started. After 40 days, Noah opened a window he had made in the ark and sent out a raven, and it kept flying back and forth until the water had dried up from the earth. So here we have that 40 back again, that symbolic number. Noah waited the full amount of time, which is what 40 represents, before starting to figure out his next move. We still have no direct commentary on Noah's thoughts or feelings, although the story seems to be telling us that he had a tremendous amount of patience. He wasn't in a hurry. The raven doesn't just get the job done, it just kind of flies around. It doesn't have anywhere to go, it just flies around. Then he sent out a dove to see if the water had receded from the surface of the ground. But the dove could find nowhere to perch because there was water over all the surface of the earth. So it returned to Noah in the ark. He reached out his hand and took the dove and brought it back to himself in the ark. So after the raven, Noah tries a dove, and this bird is at least smart enough to come back to Noah when it can't find anywhere to land. He waited 7 more days and again sent out the dove from the ark. When the dove returned to him in the evening, there in its beak was a freshly plucked olive leaf. Then Noah knew that the water had receded from the earth. Here we see the 7 again. Now the time is right, and the dove finds success, indicating to Noah that life outside of the ark has returned to normal. So what now? What do you do now? He waited 7 more days and sent the dove out again, but this time it did not return to him. Amazingly, Noah waits 7 more days to confirm the dove test. This time, the bird has better things to do than to come back to Noah. And it's like, I'm not doing this again, and it just goes. I don't know about you, but after a long car ride, I feel like getting out and stretching my legs, right? I always feel cramped when I'm riding or driving in the car. I just want to get out. Not to mention, of course, a plane ride, right? You touch down on the tarmac where you've gone, and you're saying to yourself, all right, people, let's make this happen, right? Let's get your junk and out of the bins and let's go. My family, we always sit in the back in economy. So you touch down and you're like, we're going to be here half an hour, right? People all want to stand up in the aisle and you're like, where are you going? Right? There's nowhere to go. It's especially fun to do that when you're taking a child to Disney World and she knows you're in Orlando and you're going to sit on the tarmac for half an hour when she's like, let's go. Noah's not in a hurry. That's not Noah. Noah'd still be taking a nap in the back with his earbuds on, just chilling, because he's not in a hurry to go off this boat. By the first day of the first month of Noah's 601st year, the water had dried up from the earth. Noah then removed the covering from the ark and saw that the surface of the ground was dry. By the 27th day of the second month, the earth was completely dry. You probably don't spend much time thinking about this, but Noah turned the ark into a convertible at the end to enjoy the sunshine. He took the roof off to let the sunshine in. But still, he and the animals remain on board the ark as day after day ticks by. What are you doing, Noah? What are you waiting for? Then God said to Noah, come out of the ark, you and your wife and your sons and their wives. We can't be sure what his thought processes were, but Noah had determined that he was going to wait on board the ark until God told him to get off the boat. Was it out of fear? Maybe this isn't over. Was it out of stubbornness, precaution? I have no idea what he's thinking. Was this just one of those projects that seem to linger in our house, where the tools and the materials sit there for month after month, and you're like, yeah, I'm going to finish that. I don't know, but he's not getting off the boat. Why Noah hesitated is a mystery, but ultimately God acted once more to provide for his people. This time he gave them direction. He's about to give them a purpose too. Bring out every kind of living creature that's with you, the birds, the animals, all the creatures that move along the ground, so that they can multiply on the earth and be fruitful and increase in number on it. Echoing Genesis 1, the command to be fruitful and multiply is given again. With it, God answers the important question, so are we just going to try this thing all over again like we did before? So far, the answer looks like it's a yeah, we're going to try again. For the animals, it's back to business as usual. But what about the people? Verse 20 has got our answer, and that's coming up in just a moment. So Noah came out, together with his sons and his wife and his sons' wives, all the animals and the creatures that move along the ground and all the birds, everything that moves on land came out of the ark, one kind after another. So once again, God tells Noah something, and he and his family and the animals all obey what God has to say. Then Noah built an altar to the Lord, and taking some of all the clean animals and clean birds, he sacrificed burnt offerings on it. So building an altar and sacrificing to the Lord upon it is the proper and typical response of those whom God has delivered. This will be an action that we will see echoed again and again in Genesis and Exodus and beyond in the Old Testament scriptures. Now, this isn't a sacrifice according to the law of Moses. That doesn't exist yet. There's no priest serving here, just one man who wants to show gratitude and dedication to the Lord for saving him and his family. The idea of sacrificing an animal on an altar was extremely commonplace in the ancient Near East. When Nicole and I visited Tel Megiddo in northern Israel near Nazareth, excavators there had uncovered a large Canaanite altar predating Joshua's conquest. It was huge. What makes Noah's action here unique to that of his contemporaries and people of the ancient world that did this kind of thing is that he is offering his sacrifice to the Lord, to the one true God, with whom Noah already has a relationship. We're not told if Noah had built an altar and offered sacrifices as part of his worship of the Lord in the years before God spoke to him about the impending flood. We probably assume that he did, but we don't know that. But here, he has no qualms, no hesitation about doing so on the other side of God's judgment upon humanity. This is fascinating. The Lord smelled the pleasing aroma. This is not just, it smells like barbecue and you get that mouth watering. That's not what this means. This is how burnt offerings are described in the scriptures, as a pleasing aroma. You might be wondering why. One of the primary reasons is that this sets the Lord apart from the gods of the ancient Near East, whom the people of that era and in that area believed depended upon the food and the drink offerings that were left at their temples in front of their idols for actual sustenance. Now that seems odd to us, but they believed that if a god had insufficient worshipers or insufficiently generous worshipers, that the god, that he or she would starve. Which is why the gods rewarded those who sacrificed to them. You're giving us lunch, here's timely rain. It was a mutually beneficial dependence. Dr. John Walton calls it the great symbiosis. They believed that it was a symbiotic relationship. You help me, we'll help you. We both have needs, we can help each other. But that is not what is happening in the Old Testament with the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Why? Simple. God has no needs. God is spirit, for one. He doesn't need to eat or drink. But God is also the universe's creator and sustainer. It depends upon him. He doesn't depend upon it. You're looking at it the wrong way if you think God needs the earth. Which means that God takes pleasure in the offerings his people give because it builds up their relationship. It shows their devotion, their love, their gratitude. It's not because he has any need for it. I was trying to think of a good analogy for that, and the best one that I can think of is this weird habit we have of giving cut flowers on Valentine's Day or Mother's Day or our anniversary or whatever. My wife doesn't actually need cut flowers on those days, correct? She's not eating them. They're not helping her life in any particular way. But she really does like them. Why? Because they're an act of love, hopefully. Not an attempt to bribe, hopefully. They show affection. They show devotion. And so we care about things like that we don't need. That's what this is like. It is a pleasing aroma to the Lord because it says, you honor me. You respect me. You appreciate me. Not because he needs the food upon the altar. It doesn't work that way. If you notice later on in the law of Moses, what happens to the food from those altars? The people take some, the priests take the rest. It doesn't get left behind for the Lord. He doesn't need it. So God said in his heart, never again will I curse the ground because of humans. Now, we take this development for granted, but nothing forced God to limit his wrath in the days after Noah. In theory, this cycle of recreation could have repeated itself whenever humanity's wickedness reached an endemic level. God could have spared the righteous remnant and started over and done this again and again and again, like in much of Eastern philosophy and religion. Such a cycle of judgment and rebirth and new beginnings would have by now, I would imagine, repeated itself many times if God did this every time humanity was looking really awful. We can point out a few times in history and say, well, that would have been one. But God was not satisfied with this status quo. Another reminder that this narrative in Genesis is building towards God's plan to break this stalemate by making a covenant with a man named Abram. It says, even though every inclination of the human heart is evil from childhood, and never again will I destroy all living creatures as I have done. This reminds us that God didn't say this flood was a one-time thing because humanity was better. Humanity does not change on its own. Individual people do, but humanity does not. One would hope that the lesson of the flood would be enough to deter future generations. But as we know, all such lessons, whether they're good lessons or bad lessons, fade with each new generation. We don't really remember the Alamo anymore, right? Like our ancestors did, who thought that was a watershed moment, or Pearl Harbor. And it won't be long before 9/11 is just a memory that young people don't have any recollection of. Sadly, we see this happening again. After the Holocaust, the word was never again. Never again will we let this happen. But that dedication is wavering. In our day, there are forces that deny that the Holocaust ever happened, and they are growing stronger as anti-Semitism rises again in our world. Even that lesson doesn't seem to have been learned long enough to stand the test of time. Humanity doesn't change unless God directs and empowers that change. So praise God that He was and is willing to do just that, because on our own we're not going to change. As long as the earth endures seed time and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night will never cease. Next week we will take a look at the epilogue, where God is going to make a covenant with Noah, a step forward toward the monumental one to come in chapter 12 with Abram. For now, the flood narrative reaches its ending with a poetic assurance that life will return to normal. The days of cataclysmic wrath from God will remain a memory of the past. What do we take from this narrative, from the second half of the flood narrative? Number one, God remembered Noah. God always remembers His people. Number two, Noah's patience in waiting upon the Lord is an impressive example to us. Number three, Noah's sacrifice was pleasing to the Lord, not because he needed it, but because it demonstrated Noah's devotion. And then lastly, after the flood, God chose to respond to human evil by establishing a covenant with a chosen people. Foreshadowing of the place we're heading next in the text. All right, as we always do,